out and welcome to Neverwinter with Aragon. So I have some news. Good or bad will depend on who you ask. But the Mirage weapons will be getting looked at by the devs and most likely toned down, aka nerfed, or just reworked entirely. The information that we do have is here. Brett Norton, the executive producer, is asking for feedback. They want to gather it, and it's going to be similar to, I guess, the work that they had to do with the Paranoid Delusion Companion. Every class works differently. For example, here on the Rogue, we use an encounter power, we summon 3 clones, and these clones are going to use the attack Duelist Flurry on my target. So, they're looking for our feedback. In terms of some player feedback already given, some people are in favor of just nuking the weapons, simply nerfing them, that Cryptic shouldn't be wasting their time, and they'd prefer the weapons just to be obsolete. However, their goal is to find a modest balance for Mirage weapons. We do not want them to be highly competitive with our endgame trial weapons, but we don't want them to be horrible either. They know balancing the weapons will be tricky, and they ask for us please to give our feedback on these weapons and an on per class basis on how they perform for your class versus other weapon options. The content that Mirage weapons are good in is only 3 pieces of content, and that is the Underdark content that is high item level. We have the Master Dungeon, your Temple of the Spider, and the Demon Web Hits. And with that also came the Trial, the Xemnid's Reliquary Master. The newest content they've added, which is the Defense of the Moondancer, the Mirage weapons perform poorly because there's a lot of multi-target content in that fight, and most of the clones are pretty much just single target. So he's asking per class basis on how well they perform versus other options. Well, I can give a bunch of the classes from data I have gathered very recently. Unfortunately, I deleted a lot of my logs from last year, so I don't have that to go on. But we can at least cover Rogue, Wizard, which I play a lot, and then I have some logs of Barbarian and Ranger. But to add to that, Brett Norton says their blind balance guess based on raw data that they can gather is something like this. Ranger performing very highly in single target, Bard also very highly, Cleric moderately, Fighter poorly, Barbarian poorly, Wizard moderately, Warlock moderately, Rogue highly, Paladin highly. Paladin I'm just going to forget about because they don't have a DPS path, so I think it's irrelevant to even bother balancing those. Outside of the master content, to be clear guys, Mirage weapons perform very badly. There's no point using them in random queues. You're always far better off running the Stormforged weapons you got from your North Dark Reaches campaign, which anybody can do once you hit the item level requirements to do those tasks. I actually have not bothered to get them, but you can still very readily from there get Weaver weapons from Master Xemnid's Reliquary or Perfect weapons from Master Demon Web. It's just a lot harder to get. So there is a weapon set other than Mirage that is accessible, which is the Stormforged weapons. I've covered it in videos how to get it. But if we look at some data and some math, we can see exactly what the Mirage weapons should deal in terms of damage versus the other weapon sets. Those weapon sets right now that we have as of late, from North Dark, we got the Stormforged, which are good, the Weaver, and the Perfect weapons. From Wild Space, we got the new Solarum weapons. You can see if Mirage wants to compete, it would have to deal 13% damage versus Perfect weapons. That is if you use the Perfect weapons to like cap your accuracy. If you compare against Solarum, this you'd need 10.22%, but we can also look at the Stormforged weapons. You can see they would need 11.44%, and then the Weaver weapons 11.48%. What does this result in? Well, this table right here. You can see Perfect weapons would give us a 15% damage gain if we're not using any weapons, and I've done this for the rest of them as well. If you have no weapon, this is how much the weapon would give you. Now, that compared with Mirage weapons will give you some bonuses. This is how much the Mirage weapons would have to deal to compete, to be on par with them. However, we know from here that they don't want the weapons to be highly competitive. So that would mean they would want the Mirage weapons to deal less than that damage. With Weaver, it's 11.8%, with Stormforge, 11.44%, Solarum, 10.22%. However, Perfect Weapons has a clause. If you're able to get 90% stats without the perfect weapons become useless, because you would only use perfect weapons to give you those extra 5% crit strike and crit severity, which in most cases people will rebalance to cap out their accuracy, getting that to like 90%. So now let's have a look. How well do the Mirage weapons actually perform? And I can give some data on that. Just be aware, there is one thing that's very important to note. The worse a player you are, the poorer you perform in content, the better Mirage weapons will look to be. They will contribute more damage towards your overall damage if you perform poorly, because they are just automatic damage. Again, you're just using an encounter power, spawning those clones, and then they deal their damage. There's no skill involved other than the slight bit of timing of when you trigger them. But they do give you the room to make mistakes, to mess up, and still give you that boost in damage. They don't rely on skill, which in my opinion is why they kind of should be looking at this and not having them highly competitive with high end game trial weapons. So let's have a look at some data and see what results are we getting for damage on certain classes. I have some results here for Barbarian. They use Wicked Strike. It's 12% there. Then over here we have 13%, but you can see the encounter DPS, the player's performance. It's 778,000, which is worse than this one. He performs better at 798,000, and thus it reflects with his Mirage weapons then looking like they deal less damage. You perform worse, Mirage weapons will still perform the same, and thus you end up with them looking like they deal better and better damage. So what you need to look for is the log with like the highest encounter DPS, with the best performance of that player on that class, and then take an estimate. That's probably the ballpark at where Mirage weapons are performing. So Barbarian, I would put it at about 11%. Then we go to Ranger, and you can see he's got the Rapid Strike there, and this is a 16% damage log here. Another log here at 16%, and then another log where it performs a lot more poorly at 20%. So you see that big difference there. So we can conclude Mirage weapons probably about 16% on Ranger. Then we go to Rogue. This is me. This was when I was running Xemnid Reliquary on Whisper Knight not too long ago. I did not the best. I will probably show my gameplay of that sometime in the future, but we can see 14% was the Duelist Flurry Mirage weapons. Then over here we got 16% because we performed overall a bit more poorly. We've gone from 858,000 DPS to now just 824,000. And when I did really badly, like AFK in parts of the run, really distracted, dying a bunch, you can see our encounter DPS was only 630,000, but Mirage weapons still performed very well and are now at 24% of our overall damage. But we move on to Wizard. And Wizard, I can pretty confidently say it's about 10%. So I would come to a conclusion like this. Rogue 14%, about Wizard 10%, Barbarian 11%, Ranger 15%. So from this, the only two classes is Ranger and Rogue that are maybe overperforming a bit compared to those latest trial weapons. I know there are 4 other classes: Bard, Warlock, Fighter, and also your Cleric. But we can rule Cleric out of the window. They're not good at all. Cleric is completely burst orientated. They need the extra damage boost from like Weaver, Perfect, Solarum. Fighter, generally pretty poorly, but maybe on the line with Barbarian. Not 100% sure. Bard is definitely an outlier. They perform like super powerfully on a Bard. I don't know why, but they're up there like the 25%. It's a bit crazy. And otherwise, Warlock, I think, is around the ballpark of Wizard at 10%. Again, I don't have data to back up those 4 classes, but that's my guess. And if I had data, I would, yes, confidently add them to this list. But without that, I'm not. Just be aware, Mirage weapons will be reducing in their effectiveness. Their goal, again, is to have them not be as highly competitive with their endgame trial weapons. Meaning, they're most likely going to reduce it down to maybe 8% of our overall damage, making all these other weapon options a lot more appealing. How they would accomplish such rebalancing, I'm not sure, but I would like them to take a note out of how they balance companions. They would probably want to make the clones be very similar across the classes, have them attack the same, and just have the damage scale off your stats. However, if you're a concerned citizen who's been using Mirage weapons but only in lower level content, like random queues, questing in zones, the Reaper's challenge, I must tell you, don't worry so much. Your Mirage weapons already perform very badly in that content. You would be much better off going to the North Dark Reaches and getting your Stormforged weapons through these tasks. You'll see a lot better damage increase for you, and so you really won't be affected. Only the people running Master Temple of the Spider, Master Demon Web Pits, and Master Zemnit's Reliquary are the ones going to be heavily impacted, especially if you were a newer player and was relying on the automatic damage from those weapons. If they do go and on the off chance rebalance Mirage weapons to be something like companions to scale in that way, you may very well see the effectiveness of Mirage weapons getting increased across all other content, making them a lot more effective than they are right now. That, in my opinion, would be a good thing, as Mirage weapons are a set you can obtain early on. You just need to go to the Legacy campaign, Cloaked Ascendancy. It's quite a grind to get the weapons, but if it's rewarding to do so, I think it would be very good for early on players. You only need 22,000 item level versus the North Dark needing 50,000. And so, I think, again, yes, consider devs, rebalance Mirage weapons, especially in endgame content right now. Tone them down like you want to do, so they're not that highly competitive with endgame trial weapons, but make them a weapon set that are decent for newer players, particularly when they're running those random queues at that low item level marks. That would not be bad whatsoever. It would give a market for all the Mirage weapons that are out there, and for endgame players, min-maxers who have these can offload them and give them to newer players who could benefit more from them than they currently could right now. So with all that said and done, just a heads up and an announcement that yes, the effectiveness of Mirage weapons will be changing. If you're pessimistic, then they'll end up being nerfed to the ground and becoming utterly useless. Exactly like all these players suggest. Nuke them, simply just nerf them to the ground. You shouldn't be wasting your time cryptic on this, and the weapons should just become obsolete. However, if you're optimistic, Cryptic might very well put the work in to rebalance them to be somewhat useful for newer players, for questing, etc., but just not as highly competitive, as per their words, with their high endgame trial weapons. Massive thank you again to all of these channel members for their added support, and we'll see you guys around. Goodbye for now.